Well, good morning. Hey, you guys are pretty awake today. Yeah, I like it. I felt that a little bit. You guys are ready to roll. Well, hey, Christmas is coming soon. Who has done their shopping? There was like two hands, so you guys are in trouble. Amazon does like 1 day shipping, so you better get on it. I'm just saying, go quick. But hey, we are glad to have you here this morning. As Scott said, in this next week, I just want to personally invite you, Christmas Eve, 5 o'clock, we'll be having our service here. It's a family service. We're really excited to be able to celebrate what that day is all about. But next Sunday, don't show up here. Stay in your house. We'll be giving you instructions this week and on Sunday at 10:30 about what does service look like in your home and what God's going to do in 2020, which we're just really excited about in the life of our church. Now, as I was reflecting this week, I was thinking about Christmas. And I was thinking about some of the favorite gifts I've got throughout the years. So I want to, real quick, take 2 seconds, turn to your neighbor, and share with them what is a favorite gift you've ever got at Christmas. You just said those pants? Yeah. Bro. All right, that's good. I'm cutting you off. That's long enough. Someone said their pants they're wearing, which I'm like, that's weird for a year later. Unless it was an early Christmas gift. I don't know. But I would say my favorite gift, because maybe you watch TV commercials and you see how spouses give their each other cars, which is crazy. I've never gotten anything crazy like that. My favorite gift, don't tell my wife because she's in kids right now or teaching youth, but actually was when I was 10 years old. And when I was 10 years old, I still remember this vividly because it's not the most expensive gift I've got, but I got an X-Wing fighter, right? Star Wars. It was big. You could actually fit a full-size action figure Luke Skywalker in the cockpit. And I remember being so surprised, I cannot believe I'm getting this gift right now. I didn't ask my parents for it. They just got me this X-Wing, which I totally took to the movies this last week, the new Star Wars. I'm just kidding. Still remember it, flying around. But you see, this year in 2019, I read a statistic that the average American will spend $920 on Christmas gifts. And you're like, that ain't me. That's okay, it's not me either. But we will spend $1 trillion as Americans on just Christmas gifts this holiday shopping. But here's the crazy thing is wondrous as those gifts are, my X-Wing fighter, my parents moved from that house that they'd been in for 20 years a couple months ago, and they told me I need to come get my action figures. I come get my action figures, my wife wanted me to give it to Goodwill, and I was like, nah, that's not happening. So it's currently in my attic. We're moving next month. I have a feeling it's going to end up in Goodwill, but I'm going to fight that battle. But as much as I love that gift, as much as it was so exciting then, most of the gifts you get this Christmas for someone are going to be forgotten. They're going to be played with, but then eventually put to the side. Maybe they're going to end up in an attic. They're going to end up at Goodwill. So how do we give a gift that's just not forgotten in a couple months, a year, and just disappears? How do we leave something that is beyond that and leave a legacy in our world? Well, today we're going to wrap up the book of Joshua, and we're going to look at Joshua chapters 23 and 24 at the end of this book. And that's exactly what Joshua, I believe, answers for us, is how do we leave a legacy with our family, with the world around us that lasts, that goes beyond. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to Joshua chapter 23. You can also open up the YouVersion Bible app, and all the notes we have in our bulletin are there if you search Cross Church Phoenix under events. But today, Joshua's going to answer this question for us. How do we leave a legacy? Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different this morning, is I want to answer this question right off the bat. And I want to give you this key thought, because we're going to break it down a little bit. We're going to talk through this. But here's how we leave a legacy. We leave a legacy by giving our life to God and for people. Let me say that again. We can leave a legacy in our lives by giving our life to God and for people. So what does this mean? How practically does this look like in our life? Well, first, let's check out what it looks like to have a life to God. Chapter 23, starting in verse 1, it says this. A long time after the Lord had given Israel rest from all the enemies around them, Joshua was old. He was advanced in age. So Joshua summoned all Israel, including its elders, leaders, and judges, and said to them, I am old, advanced in age. Now I want to stop right here because I love this, that Joshua gathers all the people around him. And he's going to remind them of some very valuable lessons of who God is. You know, I think when we say God or Jesus, our world may think they know who that is. But our culture and the world around us really doesn't understand that God. They get glimpses. On Christmas, they think, oh yeah, baby Jesus was born. But I kind of think the worldview of our God and of Jesus Christ of the Bible is kind of like in Talladega Nights. None of you are like, what in the world is he talking about? But Ricky Bobby often says, and he prays at one point in that, he prays to baby Jesus. And he says over and over again, I love baby Jesus. And one of the characters says, you know he grew up into a man. He says, yeah, but I really like baby Jesus. That's like my favorite Jesus. And so often our world is the same way. They have this idea of who they think is Jesus. But what's even more tragic than that is sometimes I think our churches and the people who tend our churches have an idea of Jesus and of the God of this Bible that may not be accurate. And we get a partial glimpse of that. And we think we know who this God is. We think we have him figured out. But Joshua, at the end of his life, he's like, I want to just stop right now. And I want to tell you, and I want to remind you of who this God of Israel is. So he starts and he reminds them what God has done in the past. Continue on in verse 3, it says this. He said, I'm old, advanced in age. And he said, and you have seen for yourselves everything the Lord your God did to all these nations on your account, because it was the Lord your God who was fighting for you. He said, see, I have allotted these remaining nations to you as an inheritance for your tribes, including all the nations I have destroyed, from the Jordan westward to the Mediterranean Sea. You see, Joshua kind of stops here and he reminds them of two great things God did for them. One, he tells them, is the Lord has fought for Israel. If you've followed us through this series, we actually started the book of Joshua in a series called Road to Victory in September. And we looked after kind of victory after victory that God had for them. First, they came to a river, and it was overflowing over a mile wide, and God dried it up, and they crossed. Then they got to a city called Jericho with these walls that they could never penetrate, and God said, walk around, and it's going to fall over. And they made some missteps, they made some problems, but then it came to victory, to battle after battle after battle, where God was just getting them victory and victory and victory, because God was fighting by their side. And then we see he not only fights for Israel, but he also, Joshua tells them that the Lord has blessed Israel by giving them an inheritance. They see that this land they have is not something that they earned, not something that they did on their own, but it was through God's will and God's blessing in their lives. I think when we come to this, we need to ask ourselves the question of what has God done in your life? Because sometimes we can be in a situation that's not good right now. Sometimes the holidays bring up feelings of stuff that's just has been hard. And maybe we've lost someone. Maybe we're in a tough financial situation. Maybe whatever it is, and it's like this whirlwind of our life happening, and we're like, God, what are you doing? What's going on? And we fail to think and reflect on all the great things God has done through our life. And if we think and we reflect on that, sometimes God, he often, and I would say actually he always has been working his hand through our life, even before we become saved or start officially following Jesus, that this God we know is big, is infinite, and he has been working. Now, why is this so important? Why is it such a big deal that God has done great things in the past? And when I say in the past, we actually have a whole book that's 100% factual and historical of what God has done in the lives of his people. But why is it such a big deal? Well, I was thinking about it this week. It's like kind of going to an application process for a job. And maybe through that application process, you find out this job that the average employee only lasts a couple months there. That as you're interviewing, you hear like screaming in the hallway at like an employee. And then as you go around, you like, an employee you nod after you've interviewed, you're like, don't work here. And all this stuff happens, and you're like, this reputation of this company you're finding out is really poor and really bad. Do you want to go work for that job? Absolutely not. But you see, our God doesn't have a sketchy past. Our God doesn't have a bad reputation. And Joshua is telling him the past of what our God has done is amazing. He's never let us down. But then Joshua keeps going. And Joshua keeps going. He tells them not only has he done great things in the past, but God is still doing things in the present. Check out verse 6 of chapter 23. It says, "Be very strong and continue obeying all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you do not turn from it to the right or the left, and so that you do not associate with these nations remaining among you. Do not call on the names of their God or make an oath to them. Do not serve or bow in worship to them. Instead, be loyal to your God as you have been to this day." Now we read this and maybe you're thinking, well, that didn't say anything about what God is doing in the present. That actually told, the language of that is actually, it told God's people what to do. But if you see this language in verse 6 where it says, "Be strong and courageous, don't turn from the right or the left," it's actually the same exact language that Joshua uses in chapter 1, verse 7. Or starting in verse 6, he says, "Be strong and courageous, for you will distribute the land I swore to their fathers to give them as an inheritance. Above all, be strong and very courageous to observe carefully the whole instruction. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, so that you will have success wherever you go." That's what this means is this, that Joshua started this book. They started this adventure into the land of Israel, where God said, if you be strong and courageous, if you follow my will, you're going to find success, because God will be right next to him, beside them, working through this process. And then we get to the end of the book, and Joshua is telling the people of Israel, if you keep doing this, God will keep working with you. That God doesn't just get us to success and then goes away, but God is actively working and pushing through. He says, be strong and courageous and obey what is written, because not only God did guide us, but he still is guiding us. And lastly, he tells them what God will do in the future. Check out verse 5 of Joshua chapter 23. It says, "The Lord your God will force them back on your account and will drive them out before you, so that you can take possession of their land as the Lord your God promised." You see, they probably thought at this point that they were at the end of the victory parade. They had won the land. The big war they had fought of Israel against these Canaanite cities was over. But God still, he tells them that it's not done yet, that there's still more land to take. A few weeks ago, we talked about how these remaining Canaanite cities, after they've really won this war, were kind of symbolic of these pockets of sin that Israel left. And God is telling us, sometimes we're like, okay, I'm saved now. Okay, I'm part of a church now. I can just kind of chill. But what God is telling Israel here, and what he tells us in our personal lives, is that is merely the beginning. The journey has started, but spiritually we have never arrived. Spiritually we are never where we need to be on this side of heaven of what God has for us. And there should always be a striving for more. There should always be a pushing of more, to keep following him, to keep not being a finished product, but looking to God. But this leads to Joshua giving a little time out. And he kind of stops them here, and he gives a little word of warning. Check out verse 9. We see this word of warning that comes from Joshua. It says this: "The Lord has driven out great and powerful nations before you, and no one is able to stand against you to this day. One of you routed 1,000 because the Lord your God was fighting for you as he has promised. So diligently watch yourselves. Love the Lord your God. If you ever turn away and become loyal to the rest of these nations remaining among you, and if you intermarry or associate with them, and they with you." Verse 13. "Know for certain that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out before you. They will become a snare and a trap for you, a sharp stick for your sides and your thorns in your eyes, until you disappear from this land the Lord your God has given you." So we see in this section, we serve a powerful God that has done great things, is doing great things, and will do even greater things. So when we lose sight of that and let our lives be given to other things in our world, we lose out on the blessing that God has given for us. I think of this as we ask ourselves, how do we avoid doing this? What does it truly look like to give our lives to God, to be of God? Which kind of comes to our last part of here, is giving our lives to God means worshiping him above all else. You see, in chapter 24, Joshua tells us, he recounts the details of their journey to this point. And he kind of challenges them and tells them that they will fall away. that their faith isn't genuine, and it leads them to the point of verse 24. Check out chapter 24, looking at verse 24 of Joshua. It says this: "So the people said to Joshua, 'We will worship the Lord our God, and we will obey him.'" You see, it kind of gets to this point where he asks, have we left a legacy? It starts with giving your life to God by making him your object of worship above all else. Maybe above our stuff, above our traditions, our career, our spouse, our kids, above it all. But here's what's so cool. This worship, the devotion, that giving our life, the internal and personal, some people might fake it, and some play the game for a little while, but only God truly knows what's inside our heart. You see, we say this because there was a second part to this legacy, and the reason that this second legacy is so important is there's no way we can keep it up long term without the first. You see, we're kind of have this for a reason. First is so important that our life with God and then our how we treat other people is a natural outflow. But if we're trying to represent and spread the gospel of God, if our relationship with God isn't where it needs to be first, it's impossible to have that happen. Which brings our second part of living to a life for people. You see, our culture espouses generosity and inclusion, but it's often on their terms. We see claims to be generous, to give money as long as it's not my money, or maybe as long as it's not your money. You see, the world has this, it tolerates beliefs and ideas as long as it doesn't agree with the ones that I am opposed to. What do I mean by that? Well, you see, the world has a facade of being what we say for people, but they are for the people that have maybe something for their life that lines up with the way their idea and the way they view things. And that's why Christianity and Jesus are so rejected, because the Bible tells us that the God we worship is the one and only God. That it's not one God that jives with some other message, and that these religions can't coincide, but that this is the one and only way to heaven. So you see, our world and our sinful worldviews don't support that belief, this line of thinking. And I believe that when they say they care and they are for all people, they are really just for the people that selfishly serves the same viewpoint as them. So what does it truly mean to give our lives for people? What does it truly mean to follow this path of other people in our world? Well, it starts with influencing our family. When I talk about family here, I mean it in two ways. First, we have kind of our physical, our biological, and our direct family. And then lastly, we have our spiritual family. You see, this was the larger of God's people in Israel. They were considered his children. Now, I want to reflect for a few minutes on the impact that Joshua made on them. One, I love that he called all the people together in chapters 23 and chapters 24 of Joshua. And both times they came to hear Joshua, who was 110 years. He was a 110-year-old man talk. And you don't go to that for no reason. You do that when this man has a profound and staggering impact on their lives. And not only do they come to hear him talk, but listen to what we hear in Joshua chapter 24, starting in verse 30. It says this. It said they buried him in his allotted territory at Timon Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Verse 31 of chapter 24. It says, Israel worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime, and during the lifetime of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had experienced all the works the Lord had done for Israel. You see, they worshiped God. They gave their lives to God. They were people of God because of the influence of Joshua. This is exactly why we gather together as a church family. That if you're a believer, a follower of Jesus, you are part of his church, whether that's here or somewhere else. And as the church, we are children of God. We are considered family members of him. But listen, if we can't influence and love our family, we aren't going to leave a legacy behind that's outside of that, that's beyond that. It starts in the home. It starts inside that church family. These are the training grounds to practice how to radically love and care for one another. You see, Israel respected Joshua not out of fear, because if that was the case when he died, they would have just gone to a whole different style of life. But instead, when he died, they followed for what Joshua had set up, that what Joshua had called them to do. And they listened because they knew he loved them and was passing on what was most important. I think that raises a question for us. Does our family, both our church family and our physical family, do they know what is most important to us? And is it so important that it's rubbing off and influencing those around us? Are we like Joshua? And when we get to the point where we don't get to talk to anyone because maybe we're gone and we're out of the picture, do our family, do those around us know what was most important in our lives? You see, in just a few days, we're going to celebrate Christmas. And I'm not going to tell you actually Merry Christmas today because, like I said, we have our Christmas Eve service, and I'll tell you Merry Christmas then. So come back on Tuesday. But on Christmas, we get the opportunity to reflect and remember that Jesus came here to earth. Christmas is all about how God wrapped himself up in human flesh. You see, a few weeks ago when we wrapped up our series, Road to Victory, which was the first part of this Joshua, it took us through the first half of those books. And we mentioned that when Jesus came, everything changed. In Joshua, they were warriors. They were warriors who needed to protect the world around them. They needed to protect their people from the outside world. And they needed to take the lives of their neighbors and their enemies in order to stand out and protect what they had. But you see, when Jesus came, he told us to give our lives for people. That no longer our family, our physical and spiritual, no longer are we giving our lives for them. No longer are we focused on meeting the lives and bringing people in, but instead of taking the lives of our perceived enemies, that Jesus gives our lives for them. Which means we are called to be loving our neighbors. Matthew chapter 22, verse 39, Jesus addresses this. And he talks about what does it mean to love our neighbors. It says this, starting in verse 37, he said to them, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." He says this is the greatest and most important command. Verse 39, the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. You see, your neighbors are those around you. Sometimes you love your neighbors, sometimes you don't. This week, our worship leader, Josh, was telling us a story about how he had things delivered from Amazon, but they accidentally delivered it to the wrong apartment. And he got an email saying, hey, it's at this apartment, which was a neighbor of his. And then he went there, and the product wasn't in front. So he knocked on the door, and the neighbor claimed that they had no idea what he was talking about. He was like, I don't know. And it was all his Amazon packages they actually took inside, and we're pretty sure just kept. And they're like, well, you're crazy. I never got anything delivered. But sometimes our neighbors are kind of like that. Sometimes our neighbors maybe we don't get along with, or we don't know, or we don't have that relationship built in. But he didn't say love your neighbor if it's convenient, if they're nice, if they love you back, if they give you your Amazon package when it's delivered to the wrong place. Instead, he said, love them. And maybe you're like, fine, I can do that. I can love crazy Joe next door. I learned to tolerate him. It's whatever. But as long as I can love Joe, but maybe Betty at work, yeah, she's always out to get me. That's a whole different story. I'll love my neighbor because they're close. But this person I work with, that's too much. They are always out to get me, always out to stab me in the back, always out to get to hurt me. Well, Jesus had something to say about that too, and telling us to pray for our enemies. In Matthew chapter 5, looking at verse 43, Jesus addresses this. He says it this way. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Verse 46, for if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what are you doing out of the ordinary? Don't even the Gentiles do the same there? Be patient, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus kind of calls us out here. And he said, even the world loves those who love them. He says, the people that meet my selfish needs, it's easy to look out for them. He said, I'll love them easy. But what about the people who hurt you? Nobody prays for their enemies. That's kind of insane. To ask God to watch over or bless the people who are actively trying to hurt you, actively trying to do something against you. And if we're honest, our sinful nature doesn't even want our enemies to change. We just maybe want them to go away or be out of our life. But I was thinking this week as we were kind of reflecting on this, I was like, well, what about the people who have left a legacy? Because we talk about this and you say, okay, we need to care for our world around you. But what about the people who have left a legacy in our life that has been something so different? Maybe people that won't be forgotten for a long time. People like Shakespeare or Einstein, Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa. Or even horrible legacies that we learn in school like Hitler or Stalin, and modern day people who have done something like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, people that will be cemented in history. You know what was the big similarity between all these people? They did something so different that made them stand out from the rest of the world. Let me give you a little news flash today. Following Jesus, being a part of a church, is a lot different than the rest of our worlds. We live in Phoenix, Arizona, and statistics show that over 90% of people in Arizona are not affiliated with the church and do not consider themselves a Christian or follower of Jesus in any way. 90%. And we have 222 people moving to Phoenix every single day. And over 90% of those people have nothing they want to do with this God we read in the Bible. We want to leave a legacy. We want to do something different to stand out from the rest of the world. Man, following Jesus looks a lot different. Giving our lives to a God that has done things, that is actively doing things, and that will do things that are beyond our wildest dreams, that are beyond our imagination and more amazing than our words can describe. And then as an outflow of giving our heart, our lives, our worship to Him, we live a life that is given for people and not selfishly for ourselves. You see, as you leave today and you throw yourself headfirst into the craziness of this season, I have a challenge. I want to challenge you with a question to truly wrestle with. I just want you to dissect this and ask yourself with this. Am I truly doing it? And here's our Christmas challenge. Does your life show worship to God and a love for people? You want to leave a legacy? You want to leave a lasting impact? You want to do something that stands out from the rest of your world? Are we worshiping God? And when I say by worship God, that is loving Him, that is putting Him first above our spouse, above our kids, above our family and our job. Do we worship Him above everything else, which can be really hard to do in this season of craziness? And then, do we have a love for people, all the people around us, even when they frustrate us, even when they make us mad, even when they do something to hurt us? If we want to leave a legacy, if we want to stand out, if we want to show that our God is greater, man, He makes it pretty simple here. And He shows us how this life isn't just about meeting our selfish needs, but it is living radically to love our God and love the rest of our world in a way that we simply can't do on our own. Let's pray.